I do believe that he is arrogant and has an ego big enough to think that he is smarter than everyone else and that he had outsmarted the system.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What is the most idiosyncratic personality trait about Bryan Kohberger? Not his looks, not his eyebrows, not his pointy nose, not how tall he is. Issues to do with his identity. What stands out first and foremost? Well, here's a clue. It's not his looks, it's his books. What was he studying to be? And so what he was studying to be, as it is with so many of us, is meant to be a statement of who we are. How does he self-identify? Who does he say he is? So who was Bryan? Who was he trying to be? Who has he been trying to be for quite a long time? Now, in terms of his qualifications, how is this suspect kind of in a league of his own in comparison to almost all suspects that we've dealt with thus far in true crime? In terms of his qualifications, how is he in a league of his own? Answer, well, he's a PhD student. The last time we dealt with doctors as suspects was in the Madeleine McCann case, and look how that turned out. More than 15 years later and still officially unsolved. Incidentally, I've written 5 books on that case and actually visited Praia de Luz as part of my investigation into that case. Now, in terms of this, even Kohberger's own former professor couldn't help complimenting him despite the stinky suspicion surrounding him. On January 2nd, just 3 days after his arrest, the New York Post published this headline. Accused Idaho killer Bryan Kohberger was a brilliant student, DeSales professor claims. According to the article, Michelle Bolger, 33 years old, an associate professor at DeSales University in Pennsylvania, she told the Daily Mail that Kohberger, who was arrested in the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, was a quote-unquote great writer, and also, she said, a brilliant student. She added, in my 10 years of teaching, I've only recommended 2 students to a PhD program, and he was one of them. He was one of my best students ever. Everyone is in shock over this. She also added that he was always perfectly professional with her. The associate professor at the private Catholic University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania, also said she was stunned that her former student had been charged in this shocking crime. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but Chris Watts' teachers also described him in the same glowing terms, that he was one of the best students they'd ever taught, and they simply couldn't believe he could be capable of something so heinous. But of course he was. And there's actually a clue in this perfectly behaved, perfectly modeled student, this almost teacher's pet kind of character, doing something that totally seems to break out of that character. Well, what is it? Well, for so long he's played this perfect role, he's been in this sort of model, he's trying to be who society wants him to be, and he's still not good enough. How does that feel? And compare that, someone trying to play a role, trying to be as perfect as they can be, and their peers nevertheless still rejecting him. Anyway, that was one early assessment. On December 31st, just 1 day after his arrest, so even prior to the Post's and Daily Mail's exclusive on Kohberger's outstanding intellect, via this professor, Fox News provided a slightly more balanced and nuanced headline. They said, Idaho murder suspect, his classmates say he was bright, but also awkward and bullied in school. Sarah Healy, who went to Pleasant Valley High School with Kohberger, described him as shy and keeping to himself. And she said some of their classmates, but especially girls, mocked Kohberger and even threw things at him. Now, if we're talking about motive, where do we start that process? Where does that ball start rolling? Where does that mechanism start? When do the gears start turning in terms of that psychological process? And obviously we're talking about the criminal psychology. Where does that process begin? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Just to note that this episode, this analysis is really rolling out the red carpet, basically preparing you guys for a live I'll be doing a couple of hours from now, dealing pertinently, specifically with motive. It's kind of a primer for that. So wait until the end of this episode, and then you can click on the link there. That'll take you to the episode, or else look in the description. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So Healy goes on to say that it was really bad. Now, bear in mind, this is something like, is it 10 years ago, maybe even longer? She remembers it so well that she says, now, it's one thing to remember if you were bullied. It's another thing to remember somebody else being bullied. It's got to be really, really bad to remember that someone else was bullied and what it may have felt like for them. And so Sarah insists that it was bad. She said, but there was definitely something off about him, and they couldn't tell exactly what it was. In other words, he seemed strange. He seemed odd. He seemed different. She said, I remember one time when I was walking in the hallway, he stopped me and he was like, do you want to hang out? So you can see within this whole situation, he was trying to reach out. He was trying to make connections. Well, do you think he succeeded? And so, although it's couched in very normal language, there's a big truism that is exposed here. In the article, it says, at that point when he stopped this girl, they didn't know each other or run in the same social circles, right? According to Healy. And so that's the reason she gave for not wanting to hang out with him. Well, I don't know you. We're not in the same social circle. Well, then I still won't know you. I won't try and get to know you. And because you're not in my social circle, you will stay out of it. I belong to a particular social circle and social status, and you don't. And although you're asking for permission, sorry, I'm going to stick to mine and you do your own thing. And obviously, that's just one sample. That's just one anecdote where there were probably dozens of them, dozens of the same sort of thing happening. She expanded on that, saying it was just weird. But then she goes on saying, Brian was bullied a lot, and I never got a chance to say something to defend him because he would always run away. Not quite sure what that means. Healy said she heard girls tell Koberger in their high school to go away, creep, or I don't want to hang out with you. The fact that she can actually remember all of those insults verbatim says a lot. I think what that means is when Brian was bullied, instead of her trying to come to his rescue or defend him, he would run away before she could do anything. But you get this idea that he is targeted so mercilessly that he ends up running away from girls. Do you remember we mentioned emasculation? Can you see this is a definition, a anecdotal definition of precisely that. She went on to say, I honestly think that's what led up to this, because he didn't get the proper help, and it was mainly females that bullied him. And I think those words need to be highlighted. Mainly females that bullied him. Despite the bullying, Koberger's grades were always good, and he was very into his books. And that's also something Healy noticed about him. She thought he was weird. She thought he was strange. This, that, and the next thing. He wasn't part of a social circle, but his grades were good, and he was very into his books. And hasn't that been a defining trait of this particular person all along? Isn't that another key aspect of his identity? Now, apparently him being into his books continued at Pennsylvania's Northampton Community College, and that's according to another one of Koberger's friends. This one wanted to remain anonymous. This friend said, he's really, really intelligent. A bright kid, someone who stood out even in the honors and high-level classes. So what description does this give you? It gives you the idea of a perceptive, sensitive, shy, emotionally odd dude who's trying to reach out but isn't succeeding. But he's nevertheless quite clever, but in terms of the social equation, perhaps not very clever, maybe lacking in social skills, maybe lacking in emotional intelligence. So within the murky misery of social death, a sort of long, drawn-out, pride-swallowing siege that is a social death, you can see there's a glimmer of hope in all of that dullness, in all of that dreariness, the one good thing he had going for him was his grades. And he probably got an iota of respect, because if he couldn't stand out socially, well, his sparkling intelligence showed there was something special about him after all. And so isn't that what he gravitated towards? Isn't that he was going to try and make the most out of that thing? Now, even before we knew his name and his face, there was a perception that Koberger was so smart he might be a serial killer. Just from the broad fabric of the case, looking from the outside, we thought that, wow, this killer had to have been really, really smart. Or wasn't that all part of the plan? And there was such a sense that the killer in this case was smart and that he could be a serial killer. You even had seasoned FBI folks saying, you know what, let's go to all the properties he's lived and we'll likely find more human remains. Well, did they? Does the affidavit even hint at Koberger being a serial killer? Does anything in the affidavit hint at something else that we are looking at here? Does the affidavit say anything in its 19 pages about psychology, about a potential motive, even a potential connection to one or more of the victims, even a passing comment talking about jealousy or something? Psychology Today recently highlighted the absence of motive from the affidavit in the Idaho case. This is a quote. It says, "The probable cause affidavit secured for Koberger's arrest lists the evidence that links him to the crime scene, but is entirely void of any motive." Now, as I've come to expect, when it comes to the toughest subject matter in true crime, the experts will say this sort of thing. So they are dealing with the motive, they are dealing with the psychology, they are trying to, or they're sort of angling towards the criminal psychology, and then they'll say this, quote, "Motive plays an essential role in sense-making at various stages of the criminal justice process for the jurors and laymen. We may never know why Koberger allegedly slashed these kids to death, but somehow the motive feels very important here to make any sense of something so acutely brutal." That's how the article ends off. So an article all about motive in Psychology Today right now ends by saying we may never know why. We may never know what it is, what the why is. Really? Now, as I said, one expert who resonates with me the most, who is least irritating and most on point, most consistently on point, certainly as far as I'm concerned, is Tracy Walder, a former FBI special agent. Just one day ago, during an interview with CNN, Walder volunteered, the quote I played at the beginning, I do believe that he is arrogant and has an ego big enough to think, and this is the crucial part, he is smarter than everyone else and that he has outsmarted the system.
Big enough to think that he is smarter than everyone else and that he had outsmarted the system.
So it's one thing for the outsiders, the analysts, to assess him and assess this intelligent aspect. But what about insiders? What about friends? What do they say? And I mean, we've already quoted someone, but let's hear someone's voice talking about this aspect. Someone on the inside, someone on Koberger's, on the inside circle to his life.
Very intelligent, and then, he would explain things in like a really odd way that had to be really sophisticated way of explaining stuff.
So you can imagine him being a little bit pretentious and verbose, using big words to explain things that were perhaps somewhat complicated, but he didn't need to make it that complicated. So he's trying to emphasize his intelligence already at sort of a school level, right?
I met him through some friends, and they told me that he was a little weird, and he was a little socially awkward. It was so long ago. It was like 2013, but he didn't have a girlfriend. I do remember that. And my wife went to school with him. They graduated together, and she doesn't remember him ever having a girlfriend, and I don't remember him ever having a girlfriend. And he didn't have many friends, so he would do anything to fit in. And, I knew other people that dealt drugs, and we would deliver drugs to him a lot. And so that's when I heard about this case. I haven't heard from him in so long. And then I heard about this, and it said that he was going to college. I said, I haven't heard from him. I guess that's what he's been doing. He must have cleaned up. I know he was in and out of rehab a couple times, but he really did. He cleaned up and was going to college all these years.
So can you see with a little bit of effort, we're starting to flesh out the psychology of this person, how it's becoming quite idiosyncratic, quite personal, quite specific. And I don't think it's a bad assessment from that former FBI agent. The trouble is, you could apply that same assessment, the whole thing of someone who's arrogant, someone who's got a big ego, someone who thinks they're smarter than anyone else, especially to young guys. But you can also apply that across the board to countless criminals in true crime. Someone that thought they outsmarted everyone, or that they could outsmart everyone. Chris Watts, Scott Peterson, Brian Laundrie, OJ, Oscar, JonBenet Ramsey's killer, Jodi Arias, potentially everyone we deal with in high-profile true crime. So we've got to go beyond this point, the generic, and try and be specific and say, what are we dealing with specifically? What is going on personally, uniquely with this person, with this identity, with this character, with this personality? What happened there? And obviously, in order to be able to answer that question, you've got to be able to know, well, what personality are we dealing with? What character are we dealing with? Who is this person? What is his identity? What are all those dynamics? And that takes time. That's not easy to find. Some of the people that have spoken in these interviews have only come forward after, 13 years. What about people that have known him 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 weeks ago, a few days ago? That is what makes it quite difficult. It's quite difficult to talk to his family members. What was Brian really like? What is Brian really like? I think one aunt said that she found him very OCD about how he wanted to eat.
And Brian's father, Michael, is the one that was kind of estranged from the rest of his siblings. And I also heard that he could be kind of difficult with his siblings. And I'm talking now again about the murder suspect's father. She said she noticed that he had a really weird food fetish. And she said it went beyond being vegan. He required his aunt and uncle to buy brand new pots and pans for him to eat out of because he refused to eat from anything that had meat ever cooked in it. And she said it seemed to be an OCD type of situation. She said otherwise he didn't seem...
So I've just cut off the word odd there, but you might say, if it's so simple, why haven't we or why haven't you figured out the motive already? If it's not this, if it's not that, if this expert's not right, if it's so simple, why don't you say what it is?
If it's so simple, why haven't you done it already?
So let me say cautiously, I think we have figured out the motive. I've already written a script. We've spoken about it on Patreon. This analysis is intended to prepare the mental soil in your mind for those seeds of psychological analysis. But the main point that I want to communicate here isn't that Kohberger is so smart, but that his intelligence is a big issue for him. It's not that he's so smart. It's that because there seems to be nothing else going for him, his intelligence is a big deal, and he makes everyone aware of that. And his intelligence is material to his narrative and thus his identity. I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's studying for a PhD and everyone's aware of that. I also want to nip the misperception in the bud here and now, that clouded the Watts case for so long. The criminal mastermind that committed this crime may have been a big dog in the classroom and on a report card, and in the Watts case in his marriage or on a class paper. But in the reality, in terms of the reality of the crime scene, he was as green, incompetent, amateurish and foolish as they come. I thought you could see that from a mile away, even before the affidavit came out, when some folks in true crime were tipping their hat at Kohberger as the next Ted Bundy, as a super smart serial killer. Well, he's neither. And so that brings us at last to these 6 mistakes that prove we're not dealing with a cool, calculating, experienced genius of the underworld, but an immature dunce. So these are the 6 mistakes. Number 1, he leaves crucial evidence behind. Well, firstly, the sheath to the murder weapon and his DNA. These are almost like the most important things that he can leave behind that are going to lead back to him. So he leaves behind the sheath to the murder weapon as well as his DNA on it. And that basically identifies the murder weapon. It narrows it down significantly and also narrows him down, and all of that from the get-go. The fact that he forgot the sheath at the scene, that he didn't know that he'd left it there or didn't pick it up after him, also indicates someone who gets ruffled in the moment, lose track, hardly the sign of a Hannibal Lecter-like intellect. Number 2, even worse, he's caught red-handed at the scene. Basically, this super stealthy serial killer quality crime was actually overheard all the way through. It was even recorded. The audio was recorded. And his attempt to exit inside the crime scene was actually seen. So putting on, dressing in black and putting on a mask, well, after all that effort, he manages to show off his eyebrows. Overall, the execution was chaotic rather than calculated. And of all the criminals we've dealt with, this is the first where someone actually sees him at the scene, brushes by them, and this witness is then able to supercharge the investigation into the not-so-mystery man. Can you think of any other case in true crime where the criminal commits the crime and then sort of walks towards someone in that house and then walks out the door? Can you think of any other example like that? I think the closest to something as dumb as this is the Ramsey ransom note, the rambling 3-page ransom note with a ill-disguised attempt to conceal or disguise the handwriting by the handwriter of it. Now, incidentally, I think Moscow PD's strategy to play their cards close to their chest, I think that helped create this perception of a criminal genius. One Koberger thought he deserved, and one many experts did too, but can you see one he obviously didn't deserve? This perception of someone who left behind 0 clues and who made no mistakes and who was hard to find was totally bogus. It was the complete opposite of the investigative reality as we found out. Number 3, the surveillance standards of the perpetrator aren't just shitty in terms of casing the joint at his leisure and failing to spot cameras all over the place, but particularly shitty in terms of when he actually makes his move. A DoorDash dude is making a delivery and at least one person inside the house is still awake. So in an exam, there may be some scintillating attention to detail, but in the real world, what we see is very poor practical application. And that brings us to number 4. This is not slick, it's stupid. We had this idea of a perpetrator who went in and out, he went in and came out, and he just disappeared into thin air. A patient, super smart predator that left nothing behind, no clues, didn't wake anybody up. Well, in reality, he was incredibly impatient. He drove repeatedly around the scene on the day of the incident, thus repeatedly risking being seen. And then even returning to the scene in daylight to risk being seen all over again. True Crime 101, make sure you can't be placed at the scene at any time. A more seasoned killer would have either waited half an hour longer or just chosen another day. This rush to execute in less than ideal circumstances indicates a rank amateur. Once again, he may have decent academic acumen, but out in the field, he's clueless. He's book smart, not street smart. Number 5, turning his phone back on prematurely. That was also super stupid. Had his phone been off for 5 to 7 hours for a block of that sort of time, well, all things being equal, he could potentially have made a half-convincing case that he'd been asleep at the time. But turning it on inside a moving vehicle on the way back to where he was going, I mean, he's essentially cheerleading the finishing line to what he was doing to anyone who was watching, to anyone who would be following up. The fuzzy white vehicle captured on CCTV here, there, and over there, that may actually not have been enough to link Koberger either to that specific vehicle or to King Road. But then by activating his phone and syncing that movement, the movement of that phone to the movement of the vehicle, well, that places him where that vehicle is. Not smart. And finally, number 6, And I think this is actually, in a way, the biggest mistake, the biggest sign that you're dealing with a dumb criminal here. Too much too soon. This was a very ambitious crime if you're being kind. It was lunacy if you're being genuine. It's this particularly silly idea to start off his criminal career by trying to execute such a big, risky, complicated crime that led some to think he might be a serial killer. Because it's true, most sensible serial killers, if there is such a thing, don't start out killing 4 people inside a house with 2 others inside it as well. So think again about her words.
I do believe that he is arrogant and has an ego big enough to think that he is smarter than everyone else and that he had outsmarted the system.
So personally, from the beginning, I didn't see serial killer. I saw immature. I thought the killer was young, 20, very close, much closer to 20 than to 30. But I believe although the age is now a surprise, it appears to be a surprise, the maturity aspect, the lack of maturity, was nevertheless accurate. Our suspect didn't only have a theoretical, academic, and emotionally compromised understanding of criminals and crime, but also of the real world, and it showed. To not be tested in the real world means to be untested. We know that he was very into books, and he was very into books that's how you get a PhD. To be untested means not to be ready, to be green, to not to be proved by trial or experience. And by the way, this trial is going to prove to him and to us who we're really dealing with. But the same applies in real life. And so in the same way that a teacher can't grade a student who is untested, someone who doesn't write or complete or hand in a test, well, society can't grade someone who is untested on the playing field of life either. And so it means what we're dealing with is if who you are isn't settled, even if you think it is, that's what it means. It means the status quo hasn't recognized you because you haven't done anything to demonstrate yourself worthy of any particular status. And when your status is still being determined, that in itself is a place of immaturity and amateurity, not stealth or the cool wit of a serial killer. I think at its bottom, this crime was committed because someone was uncool. And they did this as a final demonstration, a forceful demonstration of their personal power. And so this leads us into the territory, the terrain of motive, if not the terra firma of the criminal psychology itself. We'll step closer and look a little deeper into that in the next analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.